COVID-19 cases, finding of JN.1 in India, advisories from states certainly brings back memories of earlier waves and raises questions about how bad is the situation now. Adding to this concern, WHO on Tuesday released a statement that said, due to its rapidly increasing spread, WHO is classifying the variant JN.1 as a separate variant of interest from the parent lineage BA.2.86. Complicated to understand, don't fret. Today with us, we have Dr. Gangandeep Kang, Professor of Microbiology from CMC Vellore. Dr. Kang serves on several advisory boards, including for the WHO, and is the first Indian woman to be elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society, the world's oldest scientific society. Welcome you, Dr. Kang.
Thank you very much, Etna. Just to point out that I've actually retired from CMC and I'm now an adjunct professor at CMC.
Okay, ma'am, I shall correct that. Ma'am, first of all, could you kindly explain what WHO's classification of JN.1 as a separate variant of interest mean? If possible, if you could decode it for the layman.
Sure. So I think the first and most important thing to note is that variant of interest just means that WHO will be following what happens with the spread of the strain. It does not mean that this is a serious illness. It does not mean that WHO is concerned about this becoming a huge public health problem. It just means that WHO will continue to track reports of this strain from around the world.
Okay.
The important thing to remember is that there's a difference between variant of interest and variant of concern. We should worry about variant of concern. We should not worry about variant of interest, because variant of interest just means that public health authorities are going to be doing what they are supposed to do, which is follow any new strain that evolves as it infects people around the world. The same thing is happening in India as well. The advisories that we are hearing is a normal public health function. It's not something for us to worry about.
Okay. So when you're saying that, this is variant of interest and not variant of concern, can this variant of interest turn into variant of concern, and when does that happen?
Well, in the early days, the variants of concern usually manifested themselves very, very quickly. They were patterns that we were unfamiliar with. We used to see that there were strains where data was unexplained. People were getting very sick very quickly, even if they had previously been infected or if they had received vaccines some time ago. So an example of that is what happened with Delta when the clinical picture was clearly something that was unexpected and was one of extreme severity as well as very rapid spread. This is not what we are seeing with this strain. So that's why I think it's important to understand that variant of interest is very different from variant of concern.
Okay. So speaking specifically about current COVID-19 situation in India and finding of the JN.1 here in at least 3 states now. So what implications does this have for India? What can we expect now?
Based on the data that we've seen from other variants in the past, is that, this is a virus that is going to continue to evolve. This is just the latest evolution of the virus. The fact that we have found 3 cases doesn't mean that there are only 3 cases in the country. It means that this is a strain that is spreading in the country and is very likely to infect people. Most infections, even with this strain, are likely to be asymptomatic. People who are infected might not even know that they have been infected. A very small proportion of people will develop disease, and then of that, a very small proportion will develop severe disease. All the data we've seen for this strain in India and in other parts of the world is that the severe outcomes are limited to people who have comorbidities, who have other illnesses, or are extremely elderly. And it's very important that if you do have comorbidities, or if you are an older individual, especially at this time of, frequent gatherings and it being winter, it is important to be careful and avoid infection as much as possible. So, looking at masking, not going out into crowded areas are precautions that elderly people, those with severe comorbidities, should be taking at times like this.
Okay, so WHO speaks of two things. One is it says that they speak of spike protein, and then they also talk about low risk. So, what does these two mean? I mean, so if it is low risk, then what does that mean? And also, what is it that it's different in this variant that they had to declare it as a variant of interest?
So basically, if you look at the mutations of SARS-CoV-2, there are mutations across the entire genome, but the mutations that allow for immune escape tend to be concentrated in the spike protein. This new strain only has one difference from its parent strain, and yet that seems to be enough to allow it to spread with an increased advantage for transmission. So that's why tracking the mutations is of interest. The more we learn about these viruses, the better we will be able to think about what kinds of mutations actually lead to better spread of COVID-19 strains or SARS-CoV-2 variants, right?
Yeah.
So learning more is always an advantage. Low risk is based on the clinical picture, which is essentially telling us that there is no increased severity of disease with this particular strain. And again, that's something important for us to understand, because it may be that viruses with certain mutations might cause more severe disease. So the more we track all the strains that emerge, the more we'll understand both about transmission and about severity.
So, is there a possibility? I mean, there are some questions which have come to me. One is there a possibility of a wave kind of situation with this variant?
I think we have to understand that a wave requires that you have a baseline level of surveillance, and then you see a temporary increase in the number of cases. So waves go up and then waves go down, right? But if you are going to increase testing, can you really say that there is a wave? Because when you increase testing, when cases are increasing, you will see an increase in the number of detections. Does that mean that it is a wave? Well, you didn't do it on a stable baseline. So it becomes much, much harder to interpret. But it is important for us to continue to measure what proportion of positives are due to new variants and older variants.
So, how important is genome sequencing now? I mean, of course, some of the states like Karnataka has decided to test at least 5,000 people, in a day. So they are planning towards that. So, how important will genome sequencing be now?
I think nowadays the requirement is to do sequencing, because if you want to understand which variant you have to sequence, right? So PCR, or the rapid tests that we use quite widely now, don't tell us which strain it is. So that's why, in order to be able to understand which strain, which lineage, which sublineage, we have to be able to sequence. It's not necessary to sequence every strain, but a small proportion of strains should be sequenced so that we have an understanding of what is going on. The government's advisory of doing influenza-like illness surveillance and then looking at doing testing of all people who are in ICUs with respiratory disease is exactly what we should be doing, because this will allow us to understand what proportion of these clinical conditions is being caused by variants and subvariants.
Has the symptoms been any different, ma'am? In the recent times, since you from your observation, the clinical symptoms, has there been any changes in that?
As far as I'm aware, there are no changes in clinical symptoms.
Okay, so it is only the cold, cough, fever, breathlessness. Is that the
Exactly that. And please remember that the first thing is most infections will be asymptomatic. People who have been previously infected, previously vaccinated, are much more likely to have asymptomatic infections. But in general, younger, healthier people, we know with all of the variants that have come through, have tended to have more asymptomatic infections and milder infections. People who develop severe, long lasting illness are generally those that are a subset of a healthy population or have other conditions as well.
so that saying that if they're asymptomatic, can they still spread it to another person? Like in the house, in the household scenario, can they still spread it to another person?
Yes. The problem is, of course, with asymptomatic infection, you don't know that you have it, and you might very well spread it to others. But as I mentioned, the risks of severe disease are low. The big thing that we don't understand about COVID today is long COVID, what proportion. And it does seem like the more often you have COVID, at least it's logical that each time there is a chance that you might develop long lasting symptoms. But what proportion of people might have that, and whether there is a difference with different strains, is not something that we understand still. So there is a lot of reason for us to continue to monitor COVID and continue to study it deeply.